I'm fighting the color green! So for today's ADG Pro video, we're going back to a game I haven't touched in far too long, Terminal Velocity, one of the best games to play in DOS using the full features of a HOTAS joystick, which technically isn't a flight simulator. Well, I mean, yes, you're flying a ship across various landscapes, but one, it's a spaceship, and two, gravity isn't a factor in the entire experience. But this game has always confused me in terms of the power of its weapons, in that it often feels like something's not quite right with how it's all being calculated. Now, I figured out pretty quickly that going over just the weapon damage rates probably wasn't going to make for much of a video, so I decided to expand the scope of the investigation to also try and figure out how many hit points all of the enemy ships and structures have. This sent me down a very interesting rabbit hole with some surprising twists, and ultimately my compiled data isn't going to be what you might expect, but it'll at least be something. Before we go on though, I do want to point out that I am indeed aware of the modern re-release of the game titled Terminal Velocity Boosted Edition, available on digital storefronts. While the Boosted Edition does add widescreen support, greater draw distance, and stronger audio, it has its own fair share of shortcomings, and as such is more of a side grade than an upgrade, depending on what you want out of the game, and there's otherwise not much to say about it. That's why I've never covered it in a video. Now for myself, as someone using a HOTAS joystick, the original DOS experience still makes more sense to play, and you can still acquire it. Now, even though the original game is now delisted from digital storefronts, the GOG release of the Boosted Edition, in particular, actually has a prominent notice right at the top of its store listing indicating that the legacy version of Terminal Velocity will be also added to your GOG library, which, poor grammar aside, means that's absolutely the best way to get the game right now. Now as for Steam though, I have no idea if you can get the original game there too, so if anyone knows, please let me know so that I can add that info to the video description. Anyways, back to the task at hand. Terminal Velocity features 7 weapons we can acquire, though the original shareware release only featured the first 4, with those weapons being the PAC Plasma Assault Cannon, which you start the game with, the Ion Burst Cannon, the RTL Rapid Targeting Laser, the MAM Manually Aimed Missiles, the SAD Seek and Destroy Missiles, the SWT Shockwave Torpedoes, and the DAM Discrete Annihilation Missiles. The PAC and RTL, once initially acquired, both have infinite ammo, but are also able to be upgraded. Now, picking up the first additional PAC or RTL power-up will give you 99 ammo for those weapons and double the shots fired per ammo consumed, while picking up more PAC or RTL power-ups while still upgraded will bring them up to quad firing and provide even more ammo. Though if you exhaust your ammo for the PAC or RTL completely, it'll go back down to single shot firing. Now, all of the other weapons are strictly ammo based and don't have upgrades, with the Ion getting 100 shots per pickup, MAMs get 40 shots, SADs and SWTs get 20, and the DAM is special in that you're only allowed to carry one at a time. But since it just immediately deals massive damage to everything around you when fired, it kinda makes sense that you wouldn't be allowed to stock an infinite amount of them. But, well, we're gonna see in a little that maybe they should have allowed you to stock more than just one. Before I began my testing though, I looked into the game's cheat codes because being able to cheat would make it so much easier to test everything. Now sure enough, Terminal Velocity has quite a large array of codes, almost all of which start with the letters TRI for Terminal Reality Incorporated. The main codes I ended up using were TRI Gods, TRI FIR Number, and TRI Next. TRI Gods is a permanent invulnerability toggle. TRI FIR, followed by a number, will either give you one pickup of weapon numbers 1 through 7, 8 for Afterburner, 9 for Invisibility, and 0 for Invincibility. Though for some reason I couldn't get 9 or 0 to work. And TRI Next just immediately triggers the end of level sequence no matter where you are. And I should point out too that sometimes the codes end up getting locked out and will refuse to function even though you're punching them in correctly. When this happens, the way to get the code you need working correctly again is to type in other codes until one of them works, and then all codes should be working again following. I'm not really sure why certain codes get locked out until other codes are input. If I had to guess, it's probably because of a bug in the routine which checks the input state of each code. So, with cheat codes in hand, I first did some initial testing to get a baseline in terms of how many individual shots it would take to defeat various enemies and structures on the first planet you visit, Ymir, using the PAC, as I assumed that without upgrades it'd be the weakest weapon per individual shot. Now, for the enemy ships flying around, I found that it only took a single shot to take down the wide-winged snow scouts and 2 shots to take down the more slender ice riders. The tanks on the ground took 4 shots, the arsenal boxes you can blast open for power-ups took 16 shots, and this meant everything was matched to powers of 2 so far. So naturally, I was expecting the key mission targets, the satellites and power stations, to also be taken down in a number of shots, which matched up with a power of 2. Except no, both kinds of mission targets take 25 shots to take out. Curious. 16 and 25 are interesting numbers to land on because instead of being powers of 2, they're both numbers with whole number square roots. The square root of 16 is 4 and the square root of 25 is 5. This made me wonder if maybe some sort of exponential thing might be going on with the damage numbers. When I got to the first boss, I decided to do some much more extensive testing of the weapons. Though first I had to take out the 4 nodes protecting the boss from damage. But those nodes each took 16 shots to take down, and then the main boss itself took 123 shots. Oh, wait, what? So far, all the numbers line up to interesting metrics, but 123 is a very strange number to land on, because it may not be prime, but the only factors it has are 3 and 41, with 41 itself being a prime number. So that's bizarre. I finally decided to expand the scope of my weapon testing and see how much damage the other weapons were doing, as well as the upgraded PAC and RTL weapons, and that's when I discovered that every weapon the player gets access to deals damage in powers of 2. In fact, much to my surprise, the PAC and RTL both deal the exact same amount of damage. I think the reason the RTL feels more powerful than the PAC is because its shots move much faster through the air, thus hit their targets sooner and are thus easier to aim. But yeah, without knowing the actual hit point values yet, if we assign the PAC and RTL a damage output of 1x, double firing the PAC and RTL would be 2x damage, quad firing would be 4x damage, each individual pulse of the ion is 2x damage, manually aimed missiles are 4x damage, SADs are 8x damage, and both the SWTs and DAMs are 16x damage. Now, so far, this seems incredibly straightforward. And speaking of straightforward, I should probably mention the skill levels. The game has 4 difficulty levels on offer: easy, normal, hard, and terminal. And the main difference between these game modes is the spawn rate of random enemies, as easy has no random enemy spawning whatsoever, and terminal has tons of random enemy spawns. However, I did notice that the hit points of enemy targets does change between the skill levels. Specifically, easy and normal both share the same number of hit points between targets, hard applies a 1.5x multiplier, and terminal applies a 2x multiplier. Now, because of the existence of a 1.5x multiplier, this is already sort of implying that the actual hit point numbers may be greater than we're seeing so far, since it is exceedingly rare for a developer to assign arbitrary decimal values to the stats of the things in their games. So I press on to the later planets, but the very next planet, Crythania, is already showing some inconsistencies. For one thing, I'm noticing that some of the Shock Star fighters are going down in a single hit, but some of them are taking 4 hits instead, which is very odd. And then we get to the Sky Satellites of the second stage, which I remember taking a notoriously large number of shots to destroy. I count them out and ultimately land on 63? I mean, what? That's almost a power of 2, but not? And then later, when I get to the boss of Crythania, it goes down in 49 hits, which is almost double the 25 of the mission targets back on Ymir, but not. So yeah, this is getting really weird. I cannot believe for a moment the developers intentionally set up power of 2 damage values, then gave bizarre hit point counts to every enemy target and boss. And also, the walls protecting the boss of Crythania are destroyed in 15 shots, not 16. I continue playing through and continue hitting strange damage values. For instance, the first phase of the boss of the Moondagger goes down in 32 shots, but the second phase goes down in 63 shots, which is somehow almost double, but not. Plus, almost everything that's not a mission target on the Moondagger dies in one shot from any weapon. The boss of the next planet, Taitanga, goes down in 220 shots. Then the next planet, Osaicho, decides to up the ante by introducing both small and large variants of the same structures which have different hit point totals. And more specifically, these Sentinel Towers come in 2 sizes. The smaller size goes down in 8 shots, and the larger size goes down in 16 shots. And this size variation actually becomes a bit of a theme going forwards, with the larger variants of structures always having double hit points, with the considerable exception late in the game. Not to mention, the boss found on this planet goes down in 98 shots, which is now very curious because that's double of 49, which was almost double of 25. This got me thinking that whatever the HP values actually are, probably look like nice numbers in some manner, but don't line up properly to the weapon damage outputs, and thus create a situation where if you double the hit points, you're just missing the mark on doubling the shots required. As an example, if you have a weapon which does 8 points of damage, and your opponent has 90 hit points, it would take 12 shots to defeat that opponent. But 12 shots would actually deal a total of 96 damage, and 11 shots would only be 88. The 2 hit points remaining right before the final shot is less than half of the damage the next shot will do to finish the job. This means if you double the hit point count from 90 to 180, you haven't also doubled the shots needed from 12 to 24. You've only gone up to 23, as 22 shots will deal 176 damage, and 23 shots will deal 184 damage, taking out the target. But I also found the numbers extremely curious in other ways, and this led me to wonder if perhaps I could narrow down the math better by ramming targets. Because yes, it turns out that ramming targets does deal damage, but how much damage? I decided to test this out on the first phase of the Moondagger boss because that's the least amount of health ever represented by the boss health bar, and figured I could just count the number of decrements which occurred. Now, I discovered in the process too that ramming damage is a factor of time. Each second you spend in direct contact with an enemy target equates to some amount of damage. In the end, after a ton of counting and recounting because of how hard it was to focus on the health bar appropriately, I got 300. Now, I'm going to say right now, that number is wrong in an interesting way, and it led me down the wrong path. But it's an interesting mistake, and I want to see if anyone can figure it out before I explain what the mistake is. However, when I plugged the math in, I discovered that applying the math to various early game targets led to numbers which either looked neat in base 10 or in base 16. Yeah, the math was making me think that some of the hit point values were input as hexadecimal when they were supposed to be decimal, or were being input as decimal when they were supposed to be hexadecimal. See, if my ramming calculations were correct against this boss, it would actually mean that ramming damage was 8 hit points per impact generated, and that PAC shots were doing 75 hit points of damage, which ends up allowing for nice and neat numbers for the hit points of all targets on Planet Ymir, if we pay attention to both the decimal and hexadecimal values. This would have made it so that Snow Scouts would have 40 hit points in hexadecimal, Ice Riders would have 80 hit points in hexadecimal, Tanks would have 100 hit points in hexadecimal, Mission Targets would have 720 hit points in hexadecimal, Arsenal Boxes would have 1200 hit points in decimal, not hexadecimal, and the boss would have 2400 hit points in hexadecimal. So for a moment, it felt like what was going on was that the devs had confused entering certain hit point quantities as one or the other. But no, that's not what's going on. When I continued doing the math and got to the boss of Crythania, it suddenly stopped making sense, as my methodology would have produced a boss with E40 hit points in hexadecimal or 3648 hit points in decimal. So no, that clearly wasn't right. I tried multiplying up the numbers I came up with to different factors too, and none of them made for neat and tidy results. The mistake I had made earlier was assuming I was doing enough damage from ramming the Moondagger boss that I was outpacing the health bar. But guess what? The health bar is 300 pixels big. Well, technically 600 in high-res mode, but then it just goes down 2 pixels at a time instead of 1 pixel. So for all intents and purposes, the boss health bar only has 300 possible states. Still, because of how much more damage the weakest weapon in the game was doing compared to ramming damage, there must have been a considerable multiplier on the number of hit points in play. And because powers of 2 were a thing, I just started multiplying out the results by larger and larger powers of 2 to see if I could reach totals which would allow for enough play in the math to have everything line up on neat and tidy numbers, which may have been put in by hand by someone. And sure enough, when I got up to a multiplier of 256, which itself is not just a power of 2, but also a power of 8, and an exceptionally important number in terms of computing, things actually did line up to reasonable metrics. If we assume that the PAC is doing 256 hit points of damage, not just 1 hit point, then this would mean weaker targets could have hit point totals like 250, 500, and 1000. But targets taking 16 hits could have a simple 4000 hit points. Targets taking 25 hits while doubling to 49 hits and doubling again to 98 hits could have 6,250 hit points, 12,500 hit points, and 25,000 hit points respectively, and the first boss could have 31,250 hit points. Now, even the Sky Satellites of Crythania, which take 63 hits, would have a simple 16,000 hit points. Now, all of this said, the numbers kind of look better if we quadruple them all, which would bring us up to dealing 1,024 damage per PAC shot. But here's the thing, because ramming damage is so much less than firing a shot with a weapon, since it's calculated as a factor of time spent in contact and not as each individual impact, there's really no good reason to continue calculating all of this out because the HP quantities would ultimately only be estimates. That said, I found a resource online after the fact which had the actual damage values listed for the weapons, and guess what? We would have needed to quadruple the results twice. The actual damage output of a single shot of the PAC and RTL is 4,096 hit points, with pretty much all of the bosses in the game having 6-digit HP quantities or more. So instead, I decided the more useful metric was to compile the data down into a shots to defeat table instead of a hit points table. Now, as you can see, a surprisingly large number of enemies in the game cannot survive even a single shot from the PAC or RTL. But I do want to point out a couple other noteworthy things. The 6th planet, Aragon, has these mine rovers scattered about, which aren't really much of a threat and go down in a single shot. But only on the first stage. On the 2nd and 3rd stages, these mine rovers now take 2 shots to defeat, with a similar discrepancy happening on the next planet, Centauri 3, where the attack fighters take 1 shot to take out on the 1st and 2nd stages, but on stage 3, they take 2 shots to take down. Another interesting thing of note is that most of the time, when there's both a small and a large variant of something on the planets, the large variant has double the hit points of the small variant. But a huge exception to this is on the final main planet, Proxima 7, where the small relay towers go down in just a single PAC or RTL shot, but the large relay towers take 10 such shots to take out. And the final noteworthy thing is that the boss with the most hit points is the one found at the end of Aragon, as it not only has 2 phases, but its first phase takes 147 PAC or RTL shots to take out, while the second phase is almost double that, at 293 shots. Comparatively speaking, it takes 1.5 full loads of shockwave torpedoes to blast away all of that health. Now, all of that said, this table kind of helps to demonstrate why the DAMs should have had more than a 1 stock limit. Because sure, it affects everything in a radius around you and does as much damage to each affected target as a shockwave torpedo, but since you can only carry 1 at a time, it ends up becoming incredibly situational as to when you'll actually put it to use, especially since having just 1 makes it useless against stronger targets. Given that almost none of the standard enemies take more than 4 PAC or RTL shots to defeat, I think the smarter thing would have been to have had the DAMs only do as much damage as an MAM, so a quarter of the damage, but allow the player to carry as many as they could find. And all that brings us back around to the final thing of note about the weapons, since so far we've been attempting to measure their damage per shot, but we haven't yet tackled damage per second. Well, the DAM is out of the picture here since you can only carry one use of it at a time, but in terms of the other weapons, it was pretty easy to figure out that the PAC, Ion, and RTL all fire 6 times a second, while all 3 of the missile weapons, the MAMs, the SADs, and the SWTs, all have a maximum launch rate of 2 per second. This means the MAMs are outclassed by almost every weapon in the game short of the single-shot PACs or RTLs, while quad-firing PACs or RTLs outclass everything else except for the SWTs. And that's fair, considering the SWTs are hard to acquire in large quantities. And it's also important to note with the Ion weapon that its shots have a very wide scatter to them beyond point-blank range, so even though its DPS is on par with dual-firing PACs or RTLs, it can be very difficult to make good use of it. Anywho, I think we've got as much data out of this game about its damage and hit point calculations as we're gonna muster. If you'd like to download a PDF of the data for your own reference, you can find a link to do so in the video description. But that'll be all for this ADG Pro video. Next up, 2 Saturdays from now on June 7th will be a standard review, episode 343, where we're going to be taking a look at something which, at first glance, looks like an old Apogee platformer that you might have missed out on. Except it wasn't released by Apogee. And no, it wasn't released by Epic Mega Games either. So make sure you stay tuned to see just what kind of game could have been put together independently in that same sort of style. Thanks for watching, everyone, and extra special thanks to everyone supporting me on Patreon. If you'd like to join the ranks of everyone you see here supporting the show directly, head on over to patreon.com/KASICK.